if you wanted to sneak sitting in for like 2 minutes.
That's fine. Okay, you can also, let's say, okay, very shortly.
There's so much to say.
Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started. Thanks for being here this morning for this very exciting Grand Rounds. I'm Charlene, and I'm very excited to introduce this year's Ellen Susan Bromberg Skolnick Lectureship for Humanism in Medicine. This award is given annually to a clinician who demonstrates exceptional humanism as part of their regular practice. Ellen Susan was an exemplar humanitarian who volunteered her time educating physicians to see patients as the people they are. She knew firsthand the importance of not only clinical excellence, but compassion, respect, integrity, and empathy between physicians and patients. This endowed award is given annually to a physician who embodies the spirit of Ellen Susan. And this year, I'm excited to announce that it's Dr. Reshma Ramachandran, who's here with us today from Yale. She's a family physician and an assistant professor there. And her research focuses on the realignment of incentives for healthcare stakeholders, including pharmaceutical companies, hospitals, and universities towards prioritizing equitable patient access to safe, effective health technologies. She also co-directs the Yale Collaboration for Regulatory Rigor, Integrity, and Transparency, which is an interdisciplinary initiative aligning research on medical product evaluation, approval, and coverage to advance policies that improve patient health and healthcare. Please join me in welcoming her today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to keep an eye on the time because I know folks have to leave at 9:30. So I might truncate the presentation just a bit so we can have more of a discussion and have questions. So today I'll be talking about guarding the public's health, reinforcing FDA's role in drug and device oversight. Here are my disclosures. I have no financial relationships with any commercial entities. We receive funding for our Yale CRIT initiative through Arnold Ventures. So a lot of the work that you'll see here is funded through them, as well as some other private foundations, including some federal agency funding support as well. I'm also on the board for Doctors for America. It's a nonprofit, partisan organization where I serve in a volunteer position. I'm also a fellow with the Roosevelt Institute. So just kind of taking a step back about, why I care about the FDA and why you should all care about the FDA, and that's what I'm hoping to convince you by this end of this presentation, is that there's kind of this inherent assumption and trust that when we prescribe something to our patients, it'll be safe and effective. And that's because of an agency, a regulator called the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. The US FDA has almost like an omniscient presence in our clinical practice. We don't oftentimes think about it. It's an agency that we believe will do its due diligence in reviewing scientific evidence to make sure that new treatments, new drugs, vaccines, medical devices, and other products will be safe and effective before they are being administered to patients. And so there comes an inherent trust in terms of what we're prescribing to our patients, what's in our clinical guidelines, what's available on the formulary when we're offering this to patients. And not only that, FDA obviously has a much bigger role just for consumer protection and public health just generally. It regulates 20 cents of every dollar that's consumed by the US population. So obviously beyond just medical products, food, tobacco, and other sorts of entities. And so it has a big role that plays oftentimes in the background as a regulator in terms of protecting public health and promoting patient safety. And we're right now at an inflection point in thinking about regulatory capacity and FDA's ability to be able to protect public health. Folks might have seen all these headlines that have been coming in the news this past year, where we've seen a mass exodus, a mass firing, and attrition of experts, including regulators, scientists, and other staff across federal health agencies, and in particular at the FDA. So on the right-hand side, this is only up until August 16th. We've had some more recent announcements around layoffs across different federal health agencies. And on the left-hand side, you'll just see kind of the distribution of the number of career staff. These are people who have been there for years at a time with regulatory science expertise, with biostatistical expertise, who are in charge of protecting public health through the regulatory capacity of the FDA. And you can see here just a wide variety of folks and expertise that's been lost. Now you might think, okay, is this a part of the bureaucratic bloat that we've been hearing about? And in fact, what we're seeing is actually ramifications as a result of this loss that are actually impacting our daily lives and also our patients' health. So you can see here various sorts of trade-offs that are occurring with this mass exodus of folks, including that key data around supply chain resilience related to pharmaceuticals and medical devices is being missing. Safety information is not being collected or being reported on as often as enough. We are also seeing things such as inspections, not just for drugs and medical devices, but also for food products being compromised. And then one of the main areas that FDA is involved in, obviously in the approval, right? In the development, facilitating the development and the review of new medical products, that is also slowing down at the agency. And we know this because there's usually set deadlines by which these decisions need to be occurring, and a lot of these deadlines are being missed in recent months. So we're seeing kind of a direct impact as a result of this, and this is only, a few months out since this loss of expertise at the agency. So why does this matter? Obviously, it matters for clinical practice, as I mentioned before, but it also matters for just shaping our landscape for innovation. Regulatory standards for approval have a direct impact in terms of how preclinical R&D, so the disease areas that we investigate to find new treatments, might be shaped, and also for the standards for clinical trials. How do we make sure that a new medical product is actually truly safe and effective for patients? What are the standards that we're going to set for those trials to be able to determine that? And that has a direct impact on innovation and ultimately what our patients access at the end of the day once we're prescribing or dispensing these medications to them. So the impact of the FDA just goes beyond, being a regulator, but really shaping kind of our clinical practice and our medical innovation landscape as well. So I'll kind of walk through a little bit of how FDA actually regulates, at least according to statute and at least previously beforehand when we have full capacity at the agency. So you have an understanding of how the FDA is at least thought to operate or is expected to operate. So FDA in the 1960s underwent a dramatic shift. Beforehand, when products came onto the market, they were only evaluated for safety. So there was no evaluation or clinical trials required to actually determine efficacy. And that changed in the 1960s with the passage of the Kefauver-Harris amendments that actually put into both statute and regulation authorization for FDA to require clinical trials to prove substantial evidence of effectiveness. And what does that mean? That means that FDA wants clinical trials or adequate and well-controlled investigations, plural, to actually show that these drugs are actually effective in the indicated population for the condition that's going to be prescribed for. There's been some flexibility since then. Now we actually allow for one clinical trial, so not just two or more clinical trials to be the basis of approval, but also one clinical trial to be the basis of approval, along with what we call confirmatory evidence. And that might be in vitro studies, animal studies, observational data such as insurance claims data or electronic health record data that might supplement a clinical trial to actually support approval. And that's an example of what we call regulatory flexibility. The idea that if there's an unmet need in a patient population and there's no other treatments available or no good options available, we might relax the standards for approval to be able to allow those products to come to the market, to be able to provide access to patients. There's been also substantial changes in terms of the evidence required supporting FDA approvals over time. And we've done some studies to look at this over the last 30 to 40 years, looking at various FDA approvals and the clinical trials that were supporting approval to see how the shift has occurred. So how it started, again, as I mentioned before, usually multiple adequate and well-controlled investigations where there'll be a comparator that's either a placebo or an active comparator, could be best standard, standard of care. Clinical endpoints, so directly measuring how patients feel, function, or survive after receiving a treatment. And then also going through what we call traditional approval pathways, where FDA takes about 10 months on average to be able to approve a new drug after reviewing the clinical trial evidence. That has shifted pretty dramatically. Now, a majority of drugs are actually based on one clinical trial, and also what we call confirmatory evidence, as I mentioned before. And I'll just point out, there's been a lot of talk just in general in HHS, as well as in scientific thinking about this idea of reproducibility, the idea that we want to make sure that the first clinical trial is not a fluke. We need to repeat it to actually confirm that. For drugs, actually, that's actually shifted pretty dramatically to that most drugs are actually based on just one clinical trial now, and not necessarily one large clinical trial as well. On top of that, we're also seeing clinical trials where there's not a comparator, so they're not being compared to a patient that's taking either nothing or best available care. And more often than not, we're also basing approval on what we call surrogate markers, so proxy measures, instead of directly measuring how patients feel, function, and survive. And then we're also seeing an increased use of these special regulatory programs or expedited review program intended to prioritize speed to approval rather than regulatory rigor. And we'll talk about a little bit about this. So these are just, I know it's a very busy slide, but just to kind of show, these are the different pathways that Congress has authorized FDA to be able to expedite development and approval of new drugs. And you can see here that all these pathways are usually for disease of unmet need. Again, diseases without significant or good options or without any sort of treatment options available. Oftentimes, these are designations that are given to actually help facilitate the development process. So FDA, once you get this designation, will meet with the manufacturer more routinely to be able to review data and hasten the development process and also the review process as well. And then on top of that, it's also shortening review time. So instead of saying, we have a 10-month deadline, we're going to actually have a 6-month deadline to approval once we receive your application. And this has created a dramatic shift in terms of the uncertainty that we have in terms of products that are, when they come to the market, in terms of whether or not they actually are clinically effective. And I'll focus on one pathway because it's gotten a lot of attention and we've seen increasing numbers of drugs that are actually going through this pathway called accelerated approval. And one thing just to note, these pathways are not mutually exclusive. Usually drugs actually receive multiple of these pathways as designations to allow multiple incentives to be given to manufacturers to bring their drugs to market. So just taking a pause and talking about surrogate endpoints. So accelerated approval is based on this idea that we can actually allow surrogate endpoints or these proxy measures instead of measuring directly clinical benefit. And these are increasingly being used as primary endpoints in clinical trials. They help to facilitate shorter, smaller, faster, and less expensive clinical trials. So you can see that for a manufacturer, if they can get through the development time much more quickly and get their product to market more faster and also get a return on investment more quickly as well, that might be a benefit. On top of that, there's two different types of surrogate markers, validated versus unvalidated surrogate markers. So validated surrogate markers are those that we know for sure after multiple analyses that there is a direct association with clinical benefit. So for instance, viral load or hemoglobin A1C for diabetes, those have been proven through various studies to actually have a direct correlation to clinical benefit or to clinical outcomes. However, there's various other surrogate markers that are used for drug approval that are unvalidated. So they're thought to potentially predict clinical benefit in patients. So there's a promise that's made under accelerated approval when manufacturers receive this designation. The idea that a manufacturer will get earlier market access based on these unvalidated or reasonably likely surrogate endpoints. And in exchange for that, they're supposed to be completing additional studies after approval to confirm clinical benefit. So there is a trade-off here for manufacturers that if they get earlier approval, they still have to do studies afterwards that FDA will review to confirm clinical benefit. And accelerated approval, as I mentioned before, has ballooned. So initially, it was actually used in the 1990s and 1992 to actually ensure availability of HIV/AIDS medications in a more timely manner. There was a lot of concern that the FDA review process was going too slowly. And so this emerged as a pathway to be able to help expedite development and also review of those products to get them onto the market more quickly. Now, a majority of drugs that actually receive accelerated approval are actually hem/onc drugs. About 85% of them in the last 10 years are hematology oncology medications. But now we've also seen an expansion to other areas, including neurodegenerative diseases or non-oncology rare diseases, and also Alzheimer's, dementia. There's been some issues, though, in terms of this trade-off. As I mentioned before, in exchange for getting earlier market access, the idea is that you actually complete your post-approval studies in a timely manner. And you can see here, this is a figure that's done by some of our colleagues looking at delays or in completion of those post-approval studies, so those studies that are meant to confirm clinical benefit. And you can see that there's significant amount of delays in terms of completing those studies, and some of them that are just not fulfilled whatsoever. So the studies are even started. So this means that patients live with increased uncertainty or continued uncertainty around products that they hope are going to be showing clinical benefit, but are not proven to do so even years later. We also want to look at this to see, there's been a lot of claims from manufacturers that we use surrogate markers because we want to get our products onto the market faster, right? We want to be able to get our products onto the market faster. These trials are less expensive. Is that actually the case? And we looked at this from a different lens of saying, okay, well, post-approval studies, which are meant to look at clinical outcomes, then should be ostensibly longer than the pre-approval trials that are based on surrogate markers. And what we found is actually the duration of both the post-approval studies with the pre-approval studies are about the same. And in fact, actually, a lot of the post-approval studies aren't using clinical outcomes. So they're not actually confirming clinical benefit, but using surrogate endpoints or even the same surrogate endpoints that led to initial FDA approval. So again, this continued uncertainty for both patients and clinicians around the clinical benefits of these drugs. Now, this has a huge impact, not just on the approval of individual drugs, but also the future landscape for different disease areas. And I'll just summarize this very quickly. But this study actually looked at hem-onc drugs to see whether or not there's this idea of stacking. So if you have a signal from FDA, like we like this surrogate endpoint, we're going to allow it for accelerated approval for one drug, does that mean that FDA will allow it for many other drugs in that same disease area? And what we found is that indeed FDA does allow for this sort of stacking, that the surrogate endpoints actually set a precedent for future approvals to be using that same surrogate marker, even if it's unvalidated, and also for the clinical trial design to also have a lot of flexibility. So no comparators, for instance, if it's allowed for one trial, it'd be allowed for future trials as well. And again, this raises the concern around continued uncertainty for patients and clinicians at the time of approval. And this graphic is here meant to show like monkey see, monkey do, the idea that one FDA approval will set the future precedent for subsequent FDA approvals. So FDA has very helpfully put out a table of surrogate endpoints that are meant to provide sponsors with information about, okay, here are the surrogate endpoints that we think we will accept to be the basis of approval, or we have used in the past to be the basis of approval. And these have increased over time. Now we have over 100 surrogate endpoints that are included in the table. There's also a separate table for pediatric populations as well. And about a third of these are for non-oncology chronic diseases. So things that are very common like COPD or cardiovascular disease, but also things like liver disease as well. So here's just like a snapshot just to show you that on the table you can see it includes the disease area, the surrogate endpoint that it would be allowed to be used by the FDA in a clinical trial, and the approval pathway. So can it be used for traditional approval, or would it be allowed for accelerated approval where the manufacturer would be required to do an additional study afterwards? So we wanted to look at this very specifically. We did a study actually wondering, okay, what is the strength of evidence behind these surrogate markers? Does FDA ever update the table to actually show what the strength of evidence is? Do we actually know whether or not these surrogate markers actually matter for patients at the end of the day in terms of having an association with clinical benefit? And we specifically wanted to focus on non-oncology chronic diseases in particular, because these are very common medications that are being used in our clinical practice, especially for those who are in internal medicine or in subspecialties, that we're oftentimes administering to patients, and also with this degree of uncertainty about whether or not it's actually clinically meaningful for patients in terms of the outcomes that we're seeing. So this is just a graphic just to show just the extensive amount of work we did to be able to kind of identify which are the surrogate markers we wanted to focus on. But ultimately, we came down to 37 total surrogate markers for 32 unique chronic diseases. And this is built off of prior work in the oncology space. You folks might see some familiar names in the authorship list that are currently federal agency heads. But there was a whole body of work in the oncology space because a majority of drugs that, again, were accelerated approval were in the hem-onc space. oftentimes based on surrogate markers such as objective response rate, progression-free survival, these surrogate markers that are proxy measures, again, for clinical benefit. And so there's been studies to actually look, okay, is there an association with clinical outcomes, including overall survival and quality of life? And repeated studies have actually shown very low association or low strength of evidence of association with these clinical benefits. So these are oftentimes, obviously, oncology drugs that are given to patients who oftentimes don't have other options. Yet, even years later, we don't actually see confirmation necessarily, both in post-approval studies, but more importantly, even with the surrogate markers of actually having true meaningful clinical benefit. And so this has kind of been raised as a concern again and again in terms of what are the clinical trial standards we're setting here for this space in particular. So building off of that, we wanted to actually focus on and look at meta-analyses. And so just by way of background, so meta-analyses are essentially analyses that take multiple systematic reviews, looking at associations between two different outcomes. And the meta-analysis will then actually come up with a level of association between those two different outcomes. The reason why we focus on meta-analyses is because FDA themselves has said, in order to validate surrogate endpoints, we're going to base it off of multiple meta-analyses showing an association between a surrogate marker and a clinical benefit. So that was the marker or the benchmark that FDA had set forward in terms of validating these surrogate endpoints. And you can see here, it's a big search. This is just a diagram just to show how massive amount of a search it is. Started off with 22,000 records and ultimately came down to 54 studies that we looked at to look at associations between the surrogate marker and the clinical outcome pairs. Overall, what we found is that over half of the surrogate marker and clinical outcome pairs did not actually have any published meta-analyses available to actually show any level of association or any sort of strength of evidence between the surrogate marker and the clinical outcome. On top of that, you can see here on this graph that most of these also had, the ones that were available were actually weak evidence or limited evidence in terms of showing any sort of association between the surrogate marker and clinical outcome. So again, raising concerns about these unvalidated surrogate markers that are used not just for one approval, but setting a precedent for multiple approvals, and us not knowing whether or not there's a true meaningful clinical benefit behind them. So again, more than half of the surrogate endpoints for non-oncology indications lacked published meta-analyses of associations between the surrogate marker and the clinical outcome. And among those that did have a publication available, most lacked actually high strength evidence. And for us, what we saw is that there's a need for justification from the FDA around the surrogate endpoint that's going to be publicly available, and a need for routine reevaluation. A lot of these surrogate markers have been on these tables or have been used in clinical trials for decades. And there's not really been an update to kind of show, okay, we found there's low strength of evidence, maybe we should remove this off the table, or maybe we should sunset this surrogate endpoint and find something better for this disease indication. So we talked about accelerated approval, but let's take even a step back further and think about all sorts of drugs that are approved by FDA outside of accelerated approval, even through the traditional approval process. We've done some work here to show that outside of that, FDA also accepts a lot of flexibility and uncertainty at the time of FDA approval. This is one study that we did looking over a 4-year period between 2018 and 2021 of all the new drugs that were approved by FDA and how many of them were approved based on a missed endpoint. So that means there was a clinical trial, there was an endpoint that was supposed to be met, the trials did not meet that endpoint, and FDA still approved the drug. And that occurred about 10% of the time. We also looked further to see what was the justification behind this. And more often than not, it was usually because there might have been a secondary outcome. So not the primary endpoint that had been negotiated between FDA and the manufacturer. That would be the main endpoint to look at in terms of proving that the drug works, but another endpoint that was found to be positive, and FDA would base approval off of that. Sometimes there'd be multiple clinical trials, although rarely, where FDA will say, okay, this one clinical trial shows a positive benefit, even though your other clinical trial did not, so we'll base approval off of that. But even more concerningly, what we saw is that even despite this uncertainty, FDA did not require studies in a majority of these approvals that missed their endpoints afterward to actually confirm, okay, this drug is actually truly effective for this patient population. So you can see here only 33% or about a third actually had post-marketing requirements addressing these missed endpoints. On top of that, usually at the time of like uncertainty before approval, FDA will convene independent experts, an advisory committee to discuss an approval that might be uncertain, right? There might be a need out there. The drug shows kind of mixed benefits. Let's get some independent experts together to be able to talk about this approval. And you can see here that for a majority of those that have missed their primary endpoints, they did not convene an expert advisory committee. And so again, this idea of persistent uncertainty and not having the same requirements as with accelerated approval of actually having to complete a study after approval was true for most of these drugs. So let me just take a look at the time really quickly. Make sure we go to questions. I'll just briefly go through this. We also looked at this in this idea of breakthrough designation. So folks, when they hear a drug is a breakthrough drug, might think that the drug is going to be truly effective. There's been various studies to show that patients, when they see the word breakthrough, as well as clinicians, when they see the word breakthrough, think that the drug is going to be superior compared to other drugs that might be available for that condition. What we have found actually is that this designation is given actually very early on in the process. So oftentimes even before clinical data is even available in patients, and more often than not, after when there's might be actually just safety information available. So no demonstration of efficacy necessarily. So we wanted to look at this designation because initially when this was actually passed by Congress, it was meant to be just for a couple of drugs every year. Now it's ballooned to about 200 drugs that have this designation and have received FDA approval. So it's a huge regulatory incentive that manufacturers are seeking out, that FDA is giving to them for approval by the agency. So we looked at this just to see, okay, how many of these drugs, not accelerated approval, but went through the traditional approval process, are actually based on these surrogate markers, okay? So how many of these are actually using proxy measures to be the base of approval? And on top of that, for those that actually receive approval based on a surrogate marker, how many of them actually have post-marketing requirements, so additional studies that are required after approval to confirm clinical benefit? And what we found is that, okay, a majority of the drugs that actually receive this designation go through a traditional approval pathway. So there's not inherently a requirement afterwards to confirm clinical benefit. And on top of that, a majority of them are also based on surrogate markers. Okay, so that might be fine. So as there's some uncertainty that we're seeing with breakthrough designated drugs at the time of FDA approval, how many of them are actually going to have a study that's going to be required at the time of approval to confirm clinical benefit? And we found that a majority of them actually don't have requirements to confirm benefit after approval. So again, this persistent uncertainty, even after approval for these breakthrough designated drugs around clinical benefits. And these are a couple of examples. I'm happy the study, we have the link here, but it also has a whole list of those drugs as well. So, and then in 2023, just to say, this is also kind of a time of like a shift that we're also seeing increasingly. In 2023, all of the drugs, all the breakthrough designated drugs were actually granted traditional approval, and they were actually based on surrogate endpoints. So again, drugs that are going to be based on proxy measures where we don't have certainty around clinical benefit, and there's not necessarily a pathway to confirm benefit after approval. So all this to say, I've just talked about kind of where we are in terms of FDA approval specifically to drugs, and this idea of using regulatory flexibility, the idea of making sure that we can relax regulatory standards to ensure more timely access to new products. And the question comes up in terms of, who does regulatory flexibility ultimately serve? For us as clinicians, it leaves us with uncertainty in terms of what we're prescribing to our patients. And more importantly for our patients, it might also have disproportionate impacts across different populations. And I say this because, all of us take care of patients who are oftentimes on multiple medications, and we don't necessarily have clinical trials that are looking at patients that are older or sicker or have multiple comorbidities. And on top of that, there's more and more drugs coming onto the market in which we have this uncertainty at the time of approval, even for that individual drug. And this raises a lot of questions for patients in terms of whether or not we're actually going to see proven clinical benefit for these products. So just to say, the impacts are larger than thinking about just the innovation landscape or even our medical practice, but even thinking about the landscape for health equity across our most vulnerable patient populations as well. So we've had some recommendations, and these are more policy recommendations in terms of how we can improve this. And I'll say there's some intersections with the current administration that might be interesting to take a look at. So our first recommendation that we've put forward to the agency as well to Congress is about this idea of like making transparent the strength of evidence behind surrogate endpoints. If you're going to allow for faster approval based on these surrogate markers, let's just make clear what is the level of evidence around them. And the reason we also brought this up is because we actually had a back and forth after our study was published with the FDA themselves. And I'll just point to the last sentence here. No, it's a lot of text, but basically it says that FDA uses other data, not just meta-analyses, including FDA's own analyses of the patient and trial level data. They use mechanistic evidence that the biomarker is indeed on the causal pathway of disease, non-clinical models, epidemiological data, and clinical trial data. So they're saying that there's other data sources besides what they had told us beforehand about meta-analyses that are used to help validate some of these surrogate endpoints. Well, if that's the case, let's add another column to the table that they have publicly available for both sponsors, but also patients and clinicians to actually show what the strength of evidence is. And that would make clear to us, okay, what is the level of certainty around these products based on these surrogate markers in terms of clinical benefit. This has actually been done to some extent in terms of these databases of how FDA is putting out their level of certainty around various products, especially in the hem-onc space. And this happened just in the last couple of years. There's a website called Project Confirm through the Oncology Center for Excellence at the FDA, in which they actually have multiple databases that actually very clearly list out which are the hem-onc drugs that are under accelerated approval, how many of them have verified clinical benefit, how many of them have been withdrawn, and then other sorts of cancer accelerated approval. So it's something that FDA could do because they have been trying to do this in the hem-onc space, in particular to make clear what the level of evidence is around these drugs. On top of this, one of our other recommendations kind of relatedly is having more expert advisory committees to discuss surrogate endpoints. And this has actually only happened once in recent years, in particular for multiple myeloma. And this is actually before a drug was awarded accelerated approval based on a surrogate marker. There's a surrogate marker called minimal residual disease, which have been considered by the FDA to be the base of approval for multiple myeloma drugs, but it has not been accepted yet as a standard for approval. And so FDA convened a meeting of independent experts, also had the company sponsors who were interested in the surrogate endpoint present. FDA's own scientists discussed this as well, where they actually talked about, okay, what is the strength of evidence behind minimal residual disease if we're going to be using this as a surrogate marker to be the base of approval for multiple myeloma drugs? And this sort of conversation should be happening not just before approval, but even afterwards if there's continued uncertainty around that surrogate endpoint. The idea that you might have an unvalidated surrogate endpoint that's accepted by the FDA for years that leads to various drug approvals means continued uncertainty also for patients and clinicians. And interestingly, the current director of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research seems to be interested in this idea. So this is George Tidmarsh, who leads CEDAR, and he's talked about this actually in the context of some other diseases, saying that, hey, maybe we should have expert advisory committees that talk about surrogate endpoints, because we've had some approvals that have been very controversial in which it's unclear whether or not these drugs are actually effective and also safe for patients as well. And so this is a quote that he put up. I will say he also talked about this in the context of getting rid of expert advisory committees to talk about specific products, which is something that we would not necessarily be supportive of. But this idea of having expert advisory committees talking about the science, right, behind clinical trials would, I think, be really important to move forward on. The other recommendation we put forward is also having more interagency collaborations to generate evidence for surrogate markers. So the idea of not just having FDA, but also NIH, which does a lot of surrogate marker research, but also other agencies, including the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, or PCORI, CMS, because they're in charge of making coverage decisions, so whether or not the drugs will be available for Medicare or Medicaid patients, and also setting precedent for private insurers as well. And so they have obviously ideas about what they would think is clinically beneficial from that sort of perspective that could inform the level of evidence around surrogate markers, and also entities such as ARPA-H. And you can think about this is because manufacturers might not be so inclined to show that a surrogate marker is not so effective. You know, from a business standpoint, if a surrogate marker is is easier to be able to help get FDA approval more quickly, there might not be an incentive from a commercial standpoint to actually do that sort of research to actually validate a surrogate endpoint. However, you might have independent agencies or government agencies do this instead. And so this has been discussed kind of on and off, especially for Alzheimer's and other sort of disease areas, and something that might be potentially able to be moved upon even in the current climate. On top of that, having Congress, codify legislation. When Congress tells an agency to do something in law, the agency is required to do so. And so this might be another opportunity or avenue to do so. And there's been some movement to talk about this with an update to a previous legislation called 21st Century Cures. This would be the Cures 2.0 bill, where there's been some discussion about how we can actually enhance the clinical trial regulatory standards and evidence standards for approval. So all these recommendations just say, a big part of our research, and I'll talk a little bit about this, is translating this work into policy. And so we put together policy briefs meant to inform a larger group of stakeholders, especially policymakers, but also others in the field about what the level of evidence is around these various changes that are happening in regulatory science and what this means for patients and how we can actually improve that as well. So this is a brief that we put forward. I'm happy to share the link if anybody's interested. So I say all this, right, as like the current picture of what's happening or has happened at the FDA, the changes that are occurring right now. But I want to think about this kind of more broadly in terms of the larger context of what's happening across our federal health agencies. There's been a lot of principles that are shared, between our work, the work of many others, and the current administration in terms of talking about things like radical transparency, right? The need to having strength of evidence, being available for patients and clinicians to see on the FDA's website. The idea of using gold standard science, right? Maintaining strong regulatory standards for approval. Removing conflicts of interest, right? Making sure we do independent analyses so that they're focused on patients and what patients want, and also restoring public trust. Unfortunately, the actions that we've been seeing kind of go the opposite way and go counter to these shared principles that we're seeing be invoked by the administration. As some examples here, at the FDA in particular, we've had a lot of concerns in terms of privileged access to the pharmaceutical industry. There's been these private forums that the FDA leadership has been having with biotech and pharma CEOs across the country that's directly led to changes in terms of regulatory standards for approval. So this is something that we've been kind of warning about to the media and also to policymakers as well. Obviously, the most recent examples, I think folks are probably well aware, the announcements from the White House and also the FDA around Tylenol, the idea of putting safety label warnings without necessarily without doing due diligence or on the regulatory side of actually looking at the burden of evidence around this and before making public warnings that people are clearly paying attention to. And also this approval of leucovorin that has been announced by the FDA under the guise of radical transparency and also gold standard science. This is very unprecedented. I'll say as someone who's studied the FDA for the past 15 years, we haven't actually seen an approval actually ever be based off of something other than a clinical trial, and at least one clinical trial. In this case, with leucovorin, the approval has been based off of a case series of 40 patients and 40 patients with heterogeneous symptoms of autism that have the condition of cerebral folate deficiency that's thought to be associated with autism. And there's not been actually a report from the FDA that we typically see that's with drug approvals that actually has their career scientists actually outlining why the evidence so far shows an example of clinical benefit and also safety. And this has been really concerning. We've actually filed FOIA requests, so Freedom of Information Act requests, to be able to understand what is the actual basis of approval, because these recommendations are reaching our patients. I don't know if folks have had experience with this, but in my own clinical practice, I've had patients ask me about both Tylenol and pregnancy as well as leucovorin, and having to kind of wade through that when they're hearing from federal health agencies that are ostensibly with, career scientists and are supposed to have technical and scientific expertise, and having to kind of make sure we understand, what is actually in the evidence and what's not in making recommendations has been very difficult. And I put this on the right-hand side because there has been a really good polls from Kaiser Family Foundation very recently just to show, okay, are these announcements that we're seeing on TV that we might be aware of in the clinical community or the scientific community, are they reaching our patients? And what they found is that a majority of folks did pay attention to the announcement across the aisle, across gender, across the various different demographic groups. But on top of that, I'll just put show this here. How many people actually believe this might be definitely true or probably true? So the dark gray and the dark blue, it's pretty staggering. And it really crosses party lines. It crosses different demographic groups and age groups. And it's very concerning, right? Because we as clinicians then have to then take those recommendations that are coming from federal health agencies and translate them with our best clinical knowledge to our patients. And that means abandoning in some ways FDA as being kind of a regulator that is supposed to be based on scientific evidence of safety and effectiveness and being a trusted source of information for our patients. So I'll just say, like, in particular for me, this has been happening very frequently these past few weeks, where I've had a lot of patients email me or message me or come to clinic and ask about these issues. So been very difficult from that sort of standpoint. We've also been doing some writing related to this about how we can actually move forward in preserving scientific integrity at the FDA. Just a couple of pieces here in terms of, what are the principles, regardless of administration, regardless of the politicization of the FDA, that need to be upheld at the agency, and how do we actually measure that at the agency? And so this is some work that we're doing right now. And then also some concrete recommendations so that it's not going to be a political appointee or political figure at the agency who's making ultimate regulatory decisions, but that authority is actually diffused across technical and scientific expertise at the agency. So just a couple of pieces in this space about how we're trying to think about this new landscape of where we have an FDA that might not necessarily be following the same principles as we had hoped for. Also, just some more public awareness that we've been doing. There was a New York Times Magazine piece where our work was featured along with others around what's happened at the FDA. And it really talks about this sort of trajectory of the Farrar-Harris amendments in the 1960s and FDA standards around looking at efficacy in addition to safety and how that's shifted over time. But on top of that, now how we're seeing kind of a new landscape in terms of regulatory policy and also FDA's role in protecting public health. I just want to kind of put a plug in this for this because I think it's a really excellent piece that goes through the history and also talks about kind of the current landscape that we're in right now. So just a few words about our work at CRIT. At CRIT, we are an interdisciplinary initiative that looks at medical product evaluation, approval, and coverage towards improving patient health and healthcare. And we do that through translation of our research in various settings to actually enable policy impact. Our work, we've done kind of a lot of direct engagement with policymakers, including testifying before agencies, writing to agencies, working with folks in Congress to pass legislation. Just some examples here of trying to make sure that it's clear from a patient perspective and also a clinician perspective what we want our FDA to be like, what we want a regulator to be doing in terms of protecting public health. In addition to that, we write a lot of public comments, and this is an opportunity that anybody has. It's not specific to academics. Anybody in the public can do this. In terms of any policy changes that are occurring, you as a member of the public can write to agencies and say, I like this change, I don't like this change, and the reasons why. And so we translate a lot of our research in that way as well. And we also do this in the courts, especially as the courts have been playing a more of a central role in terms of not just adjudicating on the law, but also in shaping policy at the agencies. So these are just a couple of examples briefly here. A lot of op-ed writing as well in terms of, and talking to the media about like what our research means. You can imagine in terms of talking about meta-analyses or talking about analyses related to like regulatory science. It might not be as easily understandable from a journal page, but might be more translatable from a perspective of talking to somebody in the media about what this means from a larger perspective. So we do a lot of that work as well, very intentionally so, to actually make clear kind of what our research means for the larger policy and also patient health landscape. And then, of course, more recently, harnessing our research to kind of inform current debates. So just some recent writing that we've done in terms of what the implications are of these changes that are ongoing right now in terms of gutting public capacity at regulatory agencies for our patients and what it means for public health overall. It's our wonderful team of folks. Didn't get to put all of them on here, but we have like, it would be another page of basically trainees, including graduate students, postdoc students, residents, medical students, and even undergrad students who work with us. They're really what make the engine at CRIT run and really are the future in terms of shaping the regulatory policy space and really public health landscape. But these are the people I get to work with day in and day out in terms of doing a lot of this work. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ramachandran. That was lovely. And I'd like to invite Rob up to give the plaque for the this lovely lectureship, and then we'll take questions in just a second. But thank you so much for really engaging and informative talk.
Thank you very much. It was fascinating and disturbing, obviously. But thank goodness there are people like yourself and the organization doing the kind of work. So thank you very much. And thank you very much for honoring my wife's memory with such an important lecture.
Any questions? We'll take from the live audience and then of course Zoom as well, if we can get to it.
Great job. Thank you very much. I guess the way things on that end,
Yeah.
you know, how expensive getting drugs approval, how long it takes. And so it seems obviously that all the things that we send there are really important to guard against the risk of papers, or
Mhm.
these. At the same time, how do we balance, you know, the lengthy
Yeah.
process that we take money of this research and really know how all these pieces exactly.
It's a great question. And I think there's two ways I can answer this. One, we've like done some work to actually look to see, okay, if a drug is actually truly clinically beneficial and has like really good clinical trials compared to those that might have more regulatory flexibility, what's the return on investment look like? And we see that, when drugs are actually truly clinically beneficial, they usually have a higher return on investment compared to those that are not. So if you're investing more into like Me Too drugs or things that are going to have surrogate markers or where there's kind of multiple competitors in this space, it tends to do worse than drugs that are actually truly novel innovation. So there's that sort of piece as well. On top of that, we look to even separate that further. Drugs that are like truly novel, so things that we call new molecular entities that are like first in class, for instance, more often than not, they're actually usually funded through government support, even into early clinical trials. So there's a lot of subsidization from the federal government, at least up until this point with National Institutes of Health, but also other federal health agencies, very well into clinical development. And we know that from looking at both the patent landscape, because we can see, where these patents are coming from. Usually it's from public agencies or federal agencies, but also universities that receive public dollars. So for instance, like GLP-1s, as folks are probably well aware of, that research actually happened very close here at the Bronx VA. So that research actually identifying the Gila monster venom and the main components in that led to the isolation of the GLP-1 actually came through federally funded research. And that was up into like phase 1 clinical trial. So the product itself, which is really interesting just to see like how much there is an intersection between federal funding and also truly novel research. We've looked also on the private side, where are they investing? And more often than not, it's usually for Me Too drugs. A lot of their drug development or R&D into patents that we're seeing is more for that, or in devices for products that already exist on the market. So it's been interesting to see kind of the separation between this currently.
Is there a difference in the way insurance companies approve and will agree to pay for drugs based on the type of approval?
So that's a great question because it's changing currently. So folks might know, Medicaid, for instance, is statutorily required to cover any FDA-approved drug. They might do different things in terms of tiering, right, and formulary placement based on clinical evidence, but that happens very rarely. And Medicare obviously has protected classes of drugs that they have to cover. And so that also leaves them with a lot of rigidity in terms of what they can and can't cover based on clinical evidence. Medicare does have an opportunity through what we call coverage with evidence development. So it's a pathway where if there's concerns about not safety and efficacy, but what they call reasonable and necessary for older adult populations, they can say, we're going to require additional studies as a condition of coverage. And that happened very dramatically recently with aducanumab, which was a controversial Alzheimer's disease drug that was approved where the evidence was unclear and there were significant safety concerns, especially in older adults, where CMS said for that class of drugs, for that whole monoclonal antibody class, they would only cover it unless there was a clinical trial, or if there was like clinical trials that measured clinical outcomes, then they said that we are going to have only patients enrolled in a registry be able to get this. So that's one pathway that they have to kind of change coverage a little bit through studies. Blue Cross Blue Shield most recently announced that for accelerated approval, they're going to have an 18-month period where they're going to they're going to reduce the level of reimbursement for accelerated approval drugs as a way to try to incentivize manufacturers to do the studies, those post-approval studies more quickly. They have discretion in terms of how they can apply it. So it's not been used pretty extensively. It was just announced and it's only in Blue Cross Blue Shield, Pennsylvania. So it's only one part of it. And this has been suggested also in Medicaid, because Medicaid in particular, the costs for them of accelerated approval for drugs that are under accelerated approval where there's not a confirmatory study that's been done has been in like the tens of billions. And so Medicaid across different states has said, we want to be able to adjust our reimbursement level for accelerated approval drugs specifically until they prove clinical benefit. So we want to pay less until they demonstrate through a confirmatory study that they're required to do with FDA a clinical benefit. And that's been suggested through what we call the Medicaid Payment Advisory Committee. They've put out those recommendations, but it has not been adopted in statute. And you need a congressional change for that to occur. So it has not occurred yet. Yeah. It's a great question. Political will, I would say more than not. In 2022, things did change because, for accelerated approval, they have a clear pathway to take the drugs off the market, right? If they don't prove clinical benefit, but they've either been delayed in actually doing anything or, not having a lot of enforcement discretion. In 2022, there was a bill called the FDA Omnibus Reform Act, which gave FDA additional authorities to kind of clearly outline how they would withdraw drugs. And more importantly, actually said to FDA or gave FDA the authority to say, we're not going to grant accelerated approval. We're not going to even grant it in the first place unless you have enrolled your confirmatory study. And the reason why that's important is because you can imagine, especially for like a rare disease or even a rare cancer, if you approve a drug on the market and you try to run a clinical trial where there's a placebo arm and there's a treatment arm, you're going to have a really difficult time enrolling anybody into the placebo arm, right? Because they know there's a treatment available. So if you roll the patients before the approval is actually granted, you're more likely actually going to have a balanced study and be able to conduct the study in the first place. So now FDA is doing that, even increasingly so. They've actually denied a couple of approvals because they haven't enrolled their confirmatory study. So that's been good to see that as a way to kind of incentivize, but it's not necessarily the kind of the repercussions or enforcement discretion that we would hope for. And part of it's also capacity as well. FDA is primarily funded for pre-approval. So like a lot of their staff, for instance, are very much on the review and approval side, not on the post-market side.
So much. Thank you, Dr. Ramachandran. Yeah, we would mention it.
Great.
The lighting in here is not as good as
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, I should.
that I know. It wasn't like 30 minutes.
Thank you.